Hello, everyone. Welcome to American Shade. It's Brittany King, your host, and welcome to the second round of our critical race discussion. If you missed the first debate in May, make sure that you look at the description box below. It will be linked, so check that out. So I'm actually doing this introduction 2 days after the debate. I had an introduction and I totally scrapped that because I wanted to give more context to what you'll see. Before we go into this conversation, and after our last debate, the number one request was for a thorough breakdown of what critical race theory is. With that said, as someone who has been observing the cultural conversation and examining both sides, there are definitely two CRTs at play here. There's the original version by Derrick Bell, and then there's a mainstream version, which seems to be the CRT that has America divided right now, which is to say we're at odds with how race and racism should be discussed and handled in America. For this discussion, it wouldn't have been conducive to debate on what CRT is because it doesn't seem to ever move the needle anywhere. Instead, the panelists were asked to get down to brass tacks to the real issue, which is our divided look on how we view racism and race in this country. You will see in this debate where people are going to challenge each other. They will challenge each other's ideas. Things get tense, but the thing is this is honest, this is real, and this is a reflection of the discourse that's really happening in the United States. And because this panel was willing to come together and have discourse with ideas that they fundamentally disagree with, I believe it will inspire other people to be more open, to have more mixed discussions where there's no winner, there's no loser, but there is just a final goal to just listen and engage with people you disagree with, because you're not going to agree with everyone. And that is what this country is, a bunch of viewpoints. So I hope that you will enjoy this. I hope you will share this, and let's get started. I want to thank you all for being here today for this conversation, and I look forward to seeing how you discuss this topic tonight. But first, I'm going to ask for the standard thing for everyone to introduce yourself, state your name, a little bit about your work, and how it kind of connects to this topic we'll be discussing. So I will start with Erec, and then we'll go to Will.
Okay, my name is Eric Smith. I'm a professor of rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania. I'm also a senior fellow for FAIR and a writing fellow for Heterodox Academy. Oh, yeah. And I like talking about critical race theory and critical social justice to the point where I'm trying to work on alternatives to diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings and pedagogy and things like that. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah, my name is Will Reusch. I'm a high school teacher in Los Angeles. I've been teaching in Los Angeles for 15 years at very different communities and things like that. And there's a lot of critical theory stuff working its way into schools, and I think that it's important to talk about it and understand it and things like that. So I have a podcast called Cylinder Radio that some of you have been on and things like that. And I work also with, I've written curriculum for FAIR and Heterodox Academy as well.
Yep, I'm Roderick Graham. I'm a professor at Old Dominion University, that's in Norfolk, Virginia. I'm trained as a sociologist, but these days a lot of my writing, research, and teaching is on digital things, cybercrime, online deviance. And my connection here is that I see myself as a social science communicator, and I teach a class on research methods. And so I sort of got involved with this by talking about critical theory in general, and it just snowballed from there.
I'm Angel Eduardo. I'm a writer, musician, artist. I am on the board of advisors for FAIR. I'm working closely with them these days. And yeah, I'm interested in communication and miscommunication. It seems to be that I can't help but, kind of try and get mom and dad to stop fighting. So that's why I'm here. Okay. And that's my interest in this whole thing.
Nice. And then Sam?
Hello, I'm Sam. Sam Hoadley-Brill. Introducing myself always feels weird saying my own name. But I'm a grad student at the CUNY Graduate Center, a PhD student in philosophy. I also started working starting this summer, with the African American Policy Forum. I'm a research and writing fellow there, where I try to combat what I see as a propaganda campaign from right wing, but also many, more mainstream liberal outlets on what critical race theory is and what is being taught in schools.
Yes, my name is Shireen Mitchell. I am in this space around CRT because we have collected the data on CRT. We have been collecting data since 2013 on the ways in which disinformation affects the Black community in general, but overall, the perspectives that have been collected around mis and disinformation, we've been tracking since 2013. CRT is just one of the arms of which that we've been tracking. We put out a report in August that went into details about the ways in which CRT has been used to be weaponized politically, that I think that we all should be paying attention to, because this is not about politics, this is about children in schools.
Thank you for that. And thank you all for introducing yourselves. So let's just jump into the controversy with like the number one topic under the umbrella of our race debate, which is race and racism taught in schools. So a couple of months ago on Black News Tonight, writer and host Mark Lamont Hill and conservative commentator Christopher Rufio held a debate where Mark asked Rufio, what do you see as troublesome about letting students know early on that race is an issue and that American slavery is one of the foundations of this country? Rufio responded saying, I'm fine with history being taught, but when dogma compels students on what to think, that promotes segregation and lawmakers should step in. So a lot of people are waiting on this. It's been talked about, across the country. There's been school boards held nationally, and generally on the anti side of this, there's this notion that the left's approach to discussing race and racism preaches Black victimhood and vilifies white people for a crime they didn't commit. But on the pro side of this, they've expressed the idea of discussing, examining race through a critical lens is not to victimize Black or white people, but to tell the truth about America. So my first question will echo both Rufio and Mark's sentiments. Do you find it vital to teach students about racism and race early on in schools, or do you think it promotes a segregationist mindset? And before you answer this, I'm going to ask you to preface with your definition of racism, because again, that's very subjective and people have their own terminology. So if you can do that, it'll best conceptualize your answer for us.
Well, I can go first here. I think we need to talk about accurate history, and I think we are talking about accurate history often. The thing is, how are we teaching that accurate history? What ideological position? I think talking about racism from a classical liberal stance is a good thing. What that does is let students know, little kids, right? We're talking about kids, right? Elementary school and not high school and college. It's good for kids to understand that racism was a thing, a big thing in this country, and that we are moving away from that. That's the idea anyway, and that we should not discriminate based solely on skin color and ethnicity. But, and cliche, and it has been a cliche for 50 years, content of people's character. Right? So I think it's important to discuss race from that standpoint. Issue with CRT or its manifestation in school. Some people call it, critical social justice, whatever you want to call it. Doing it from that standpoint is a little different because it is liberal. You are putting people, centralizing them in those groups. A lot of detrimental things. So if people want to talk about classical liberal racism and illiberal critical race theory racism, simultaneously talk about the fact that some people look at it this way, other people look at it that way. That's one thing. And I think that can be done critically, the original. But one thing is seen as the way of doing something, then problems are indoctrination is often the case.
I think there might be a connection issue. I don't know if anyone else heard it, but
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. I didn't know if it was just me. Erec, it's a little like you're cutting in and out. So, I mean, we heard you.
I got
but
some of it, but it's like there were spaces where you kind of went out a little bit. So I'll go next, just because I think I heard a good portion of what he said, and I'm probably coming from a different stance in that regard. And here's this. We don't have to teach racism in the schools because as a child, as a Black child in the schools, we're going to experience it from the time that we're children, whether it's elementary school, from the day one all the way up until high school when we leave. So when people say to me, you know, we're going to have this conversation, what I'm hearing is we're going to make sure that people are aware of those biases so those biases do not happen, and that we're looking at it from a broader lens. The concept that, you know, my white child at 5 should not know that racism exists while my child at 5 is going to know it exists in that same classroom just seems quite odd to me. So when we have these conversations like the life of Ruby Bridges and the reason why that nobody wants her book in the school, when a 6-year-old literally had to deal with racism going to school, and you're talking about you want to tell history, but you want her part of the history removed from the history books, we have a problem. We have a fundamental flaw. The fact that people say we want to tell history, what they're saying is we want to tell portions of the history. We want to take those portions that we feel good about, remove the bad parts, and then try to move on into a future that's supposed to not know our history while we basically will at some point repeat them. Because that's what we've been doing. We've been repeating different forms of history. As far as I'm concerned, we're in Jim Crow 2.0 with these voter suppression bills. We might as well be back to my grandmother's time. So when I hear that, I hear distinctions that say that we don't want to be honest about, you know, which I feel that happens in America quite often. America has an honesty problem. We want to make sure that the way that we tell that story lands in the spectrum of American exceptionalism. And we want to make sure our children believe this exceptionalism of America in such a way that it's disingenuous and they can't effectively operate in our country, because our country does not operate anywhere near any of that. That's the reality. Some of our parts of our history is great. Some of our parts of our history is downright horrific and disgusting. And the fact that you're telling me you're expecting children not to know about either one of those just doesn't make any sense to me. So for me, when I listen to this and I hear the narratives that are being told, what I see is you're saying one group of children should live in existence of ideology, idealized exceptionalism, while the other children are experiencing in the same room an entirely different thing. And we're supposed to be okay with that. Okay, that to me doesn't make any sense. So the problem is that my first experience with racism, what number is that? 4.
Yeah, we know how to count.
Thank you. So to say to me elementary school children are not supposed to experience that just doesn't make sense when there's no choice for some of us. So I would love to get into these conversations about the ways in which we can look at that and the way that we can discuss that. But if you're telling me you want history to continue, that means we got to tell the good and bad of history. We can't keep singing Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream and content of the character when we know that ain't happening. Thanks.
All right, I'd like to go next. I agree with Shireen that we need to teach it. I'll start from a social science standpoint and not from a history one, because I really don't know what goes on in terms of the scholarship there. But I can say that there's no many sides to this. There just isn't. If you've got a junior high social studies teacher who decides, okay, I want to talk about racism in my class, then what they're going to do is what all K through 12 teachers do, is they get the information that trickles down from the knowledge creators, and then they teach it. And there is no I don't even know what a classical liberal viewpoint to racial dynamics is. I mean, there's this quote by Neil deGrasse Tyson that I love, and he says, nature is not obligated to make sense to you, meaning it doesn't matter what values you have. It just that's what happens. And I take the same approach with social science. I mean, I don't know how you can impose classical liberal or conservatism or progressivism on these things that are happening in the world. So the things that come down from academia, sure, Democrats, professors who are Democrats, they tend to be the ones who are producing that knowledge, but it's there. They're not making it up. And so it trickles down into K 2 through 12 in a social studies class, and it's taught. And I think putting this idea of two sides or many sides is ridiculous. It's a way of, in my opinion, importing a different ideology into class under the guise of saying you want many ideologies in the class. And I find that very disingenuous. And you did ask what my opinion of racism was, or what my definition was, and I don't know if the others did. I don't think so. For me, it's a multi-level, multifaceted thing where you've got individual values and beliefs, you've got law and policy. All of those things work together to produce racial inequality. And the task of a social scientist is to identify those things, describe them, and then depending on if you're a critical scholar or not, maybe try and come up with solutions to deal with them. Some scholars just point them out, they're standard social scientists. Others try to do something about it.
Can I go next? Is that allowed? Thanks everyone for contribution so far. Something in Rod's answer that I disagree with. Well, I'm not sure actually if I disagree with it. It could have just been the words that Rod used, or the way that I interpreted the words that Rod used. In terms of the definition, I think that one idea from so-called classical liberalism, at least in the philosophical, like normative ideal sense of something that we strive towards, because it certainly hasn't ever, been actualized in any historical society that I have seen. In terms of equal protection of the law for everyone, I don't think that exists in any society that I've seen. But as an ideal, right, as the way that society should be, one of the things of classical liberalism is, about free and open inquiry and debate. This idea of like a marketplace of ideas, which I think is not the best metaphor or the most descriptively apt, but one thing that I think we should recognize is that the word racism, just like many, very normatively loaded words, the definition is not clear cut, right? Like you can go and look at how the definition in certain dictionaries, say, has changed over time, what things remain constant within that definition, and that definition is itself a political tool that people can use, right? Because a lot of Republicans nowadays will say, well, those Democrats changing the definition of racism, and that's seen as like a bad thing, right? It's Orwellian, it's totalitarian, it's not a good thing to, change the meanings of words. So the one that I use, and this is taken from my late, rest in peace, professor Charles Mills in his book Black Rights, White Wrongs, and this paragraph I think sums it up perfectly. Racism has been given various competing definitions and attributed competing areas of application. I would distinguish between racism in the ideational sense, a complex of ideas, beliefs, values, and racism in the socio-institutional sense, institutions, practices, social systems. So for the first, interpersonal or ideational sense, he favors this definition. Racism is the belief that humanity can be divided into discrete races, and these races are hierarchically arranged with some races superior to others. The institutional sense of racism refers to institutions, practices, and social systems that illicitly privilege some races at the expense of others, where racial membership, whether directly or indirectly, explains this privileging. I think that's a great way to think about it. I think racism is a term that does apply both to institutions and social systems and practices and policies, as well as the individual beliefs, statements, actions of persons.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll go. I have a network of a bunch of teachers that I talk to regularly.
Oh, no.
Oh, you're freezing up, Will.
No.
And he let me know. Well, you just froze up, but you're fine now. I know, dang it. But I think you're fine. So go ahead.
I'm in the basement of my school. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. some states didn't have like Jim Crow in their state standards, but now I believe they all do. So all 50 states have slavery, Jim Crow, even like Japanese internment and stuff like that is in most of the 50 states state standards. So when teachers are deciding to teach what to teach, they have to follow the state standards. That's like the way that it works, especially in public schools. I think in private schools it gets a little bit more loosey-goosey, but they are being taught. And a lot of the pushback that I see among other teachers is not about teaching slavery, Jim Crow, the horrors of those things. It's about teaching these more broad concepts that maybe we'll get into, like whiteness and things like that. That's not aligned with any state standards or anything like that. So that's where I see like maybe a disconnect, and where we get off the topic of, should we be teaching about the horrors of slavery, the American history, warts and all? Yes. And I think most people, I think all people that are reasonable would agree with that. But I think that that's not necessarily where the conversation should be held, I guess. If that makes sense. And my definition of racism, Sam, I think yours is more robust, but mine is very simple. And I learned this from like, I had a race in America class at Penn State in 2004. And it was essentially like racism is a system or a belief, where it's the belief that a group is inferior or superior because of their race, or an individual is inferior or superior because of their race. That's what causes them to be inferior or superior. And it's very basic, but that's kind of the way that it was, at least whatever that is, 17 years ago.
Okay, well, this is really interesting. I think so many of our responses are kind of responding to different questions or different points of view. And it may seem like we're responding to the same question, Brittany, but I don't think that that's necessarily the case. And it might be hard to parse because everyone's coming from a different perspective where they have different things in mind. But, at least from my part, should we teach about racism, and should we teach about American history and the horrors of American history and all the terrible things about America? Yes, absolutely. And I am of the opinion that the vast majority of people agree with this. Where we get significant disagreement is in how we're going to do that, and maybe to what extreme we're going to do that. So, things like affinity groups and things like, it depends. It depends on the age of the kid. It depends on what exactly is going on there. And it's hard to have a kind of general conversation because, pretty much each classroom is going to be a different situation. There might be different things going on based on where the teacher's coming from, what the teacher thinks is important versus less important, and all that sort of stuff. But, I think what's interesting to me is, after having read the book Racecraft by Barbara and Karen Fields, which I recommend, I'm trying my best to pick up on what is called racecraft, as much as I can in my own kind of thinking and speaking, and in the thinking and speaking of everybody else. So Sam's definition of racism, I largely agree with, except there's this one kind of racecraft switch that happened in there that I wouldn't have noticed 6 months ago, right? But so the first definition was, the belief that humanity can be divided up into different races, and there is a hierarchy of, superior and inferior races. That's one definition of racism. And then the other definition was, kind of I guess the application of double standards based on race. But that second definition presupposes the existence of the thing that makes you racist in the first definition. So I might be misremembering because a lot went on there, but that's what I picked up on. And I think that is kind of the key for me in terms of how we teach this stuff. We should teach it, and we should teach, this is what people believed. This is what people did. This is what happened. This is how horrible it was. These are the reverberations of those beliefs and behaviors in our history and how they kind of still manifest themselves in the present. We should absolutely do all of that stuff. But I think a trap that we fall into is inadvertently perpetuating these things by, the packaging in which we deliver this stuff is kind of reifying the concepts that began the whole thing in the first place. You know, telling kids that they are black and that they are white and that they are brown and that there are fundamental differences between them on that basis, right? Not a social thing, but of a thing of you are white and you are black. I think that is already kicking the door open to so many problems down the line. And the way that kids may internalize this sort of teaching begins there, in my view. And I think a lot could be avoided if we simply say, look, the belief in race caused these things. We don't do this anymore, right? It doesn't mean we don't recognize racism. It doesn't mean we pretend it doesn't exist, because of course it does, right? But we have to separate the behavior based on the belief in the thing and belief in the thing itself, and not inadvertently reify and reinforce these categories and these concepts over and over and over again, and just kind of keep ourselves under the water of it. So that's my point of view. I feel like so much of it would be solved if we could just flip that switch or made a more conscious effort to kind of divorce ourselves from the concepts, instead of saying, you know, these people were segregated, these people were oppressed because they were black. It would be, you know, these people were oppressed and these people were segregated because they were seen as a different race. They were seen as different fundamentally from the other people who were in power and able to assert that dominance against them. So that's my 2 cents, at least for now.
Angel, to play devil's advocate, can you clarify more about when you said we don't do this anymore? Are you talking about in a sense of our goal is not to do this, or right now we don't do this?
Yeah, like we should each consciously say, I'm going to stop reinforcing and reifying these ideas, right? I'm not going to pretend that they don't exist or that they didn't, or that the effects of belief in them in the past doesn't have an effect today, right? I just want to be clear about that. But we don't have to keep it going. We don't have to keep playing the game by using the language that we use, and even just our own conceptual framing, the way that we think and look at this stuff, the way we think about it and look at it, inadvertently reinforces the thing and makes it real. That's what racecraft is, right? Race is the idea. Racism is thoughts and behaviors based on a belief in the idea. And racecraft is the kind of trick that happens where the thoughts and behaviors based on a belief in the idea give the illusion that the idea is real. And that's the thing that we should be mindful of, in my opinion, and do something about. So we should shift the way our conversation is, and we should shift the way that we approach, you know, contextualizing and framing history so that we don't continue it, even inadvertently.
And Sam, were you about to say something? Or...
I don't know whether I should, because I feel like I feel like Angel and I should maybe have a separate conversation about that book, because I don't think he's interpreting the Field Sisters correctly. But
or you have different point of views. But
it could just be that. But
it's a tough book to read. I'll fully admit I had to reread, you know, chapters because it's written in a way that it was not accessible to me, at least. So it's totally possible that I'm not understanding something.
Well, I want to move on to this because, Angel, you're talking about something that actually a viewer was asking about, and it's the notion of how white people are feeling vilified in our current conversation about racism. And just to preface, there was an NPR article that stated 55% of white Americans believe that they experience racism in America. And CRT opposers like Chris Rufio believe white people experience racism, and others say it's impossible. So this viewer wants to know, can white people experience racism? Why or why not? And also, they also kind of went into what you were saying, is that they feel the conversation is turning everyone racist, is how they expressed it. I don't know if that was what you're getting at, Angel, or not, but
yeah.
Yeah, that's what they asked me to ask. So first, can white people experience racism? Why or why not?
I'd love to. I'm sorry.
No, you want to go?
Okay, I would love to, because I get this question all the time. So I like to address it and maybe make people upset. But no, white people, at least in the way that in a group level sense, no, white people cannot experience racism. But the way that I communicate that is, if people want to say that white people experience racism, I say fine. And then in my head, I retranslate that as prejudice or discrimination. Because certainly someone can look at a white person and think certain thoughts about them, negative thoughts, that would be prejudice, or they can act differently towards them, that would be discrimination. But the way that, at least in modern times, how we understand racism, it really requires that a group of people have control of enough resources to impose at a group level that prejudice and discrimination. So just to give it a more real world scenario here, if a white lawyer is in Atlanta and he goes into a law firm that's owned by Black people, and that Black person says, maybe not to his face, but they kind of whisper, we don't want to hire that white dude. That's discrimination, and that's wrong. That white person, though, can probably walk across the street. I don't know, Atlanta's different, right? But in most cities, they can probably walk across the street and just and don't have that problem. Now, compare that to, I don't know, maybe the Jim Crow South, where a Black person, or even sometimes now, maybe, in many places that Black people go into, they're going to face that consistently. And that is racism, what that Black person is experiencing because of that group level difference.
I think it's interesting. May I go? I think it's interesting that I like your explanation, Roderick. But I think it's interesting that you had to go to the Jim Crow South to make that point and say sometimes things happen here. I know things still happen here, but when it comes to that level of racism, where if I don't get the job here, I as a Black man will probably not get the job anyplace else. That's not really the reality I've been seeing throughout my life. I don't want to do a whole lived experience thing, but I think things are a little different these days. Regarding the definition of racism, the idea that you can only be racist if you have power to go along with that discrimination, that's fine if we want to redefine racism that way. But I'm a big fan of adjectives, right? A white person can experience racism. It's just a different kind of racism. I don't know. Call it hegemonic racism versus counter-hegemonic racism. I don't know. Figure something out. It's both racist. They're just different adjectives need to be applied to each one. That's how I look at it. Now, if we need to get it out there that discrimination means one thing and racism means another thing, fine. But we have to realize that most people don't look at it that way. And when we say racism in the racist discrimination plus power sense, most people don't know we're talking about it like that. So, I mean, I like the idea of adjectives, qualifying certain kinds of racism instead of just saying racism can't happen to white people.
There's also something to be said for just, clarity. I mean, the situation Rod described is a person racialized as white being discriminated against on the basis of his perceived race. That is a very practical and intuitive definition for racism, right? Like that's I grew up understanding that that's what it was, and it totally makes sense to me. So that this idea, I started to hear, in the last 10 years or so of people who look like me can't be racist. I'm like, you have never met my family, because they're insanely racist. They're insanely racist against a bunch of different groups of people, So it's like the concept seems silly to me, right? But I understand wanting to have a term to describe the larger scale situation, right? The thing that Rod is pointing to, which I think is right, is that there is obviously a difference when you zoom out to the group level, and yes, somebody has a kind of an environment where they're surrounded by this, rather than maybe just one individual encounter. There's a difference there, and it matters, and we should be able to point that out because you're going to address those things differently. But I don't know if redefining racism to fit the one thing and not the other is going to be helpful. It's going to create miscommunication. I mean, so many people are still having to be lectured about, no, that's not what racism means. What racism means is prejudice plus power. So what you're talking about is not racism. And they're like, well, I mean, it feels fucking racist to me. I don't know, so I just feel like I'm not sure what the utility is of leaning into this kind of thing. The point should be to illustrate the problem, to highlight the problem, whatever the problem is that we're trying to highlight, whether it's the group level one that Rod pointed out or an individual level one that is usually where the kind of redefinition thing comes up, right? Both of those can be racism. We can just come up with a different way of clarifying so that everyone's on the same page.
You might call one systemic racism, right?
Yeah.
The very wide.
Wait a minute.
That's perfectly fine with me.
Yeah. But that was just weird. The example was someone is discriminating against me, which is the phenomena. So then let's call it something else, racism. The way that I'm describing it is actually more precise because I'm separating those phenomena out so that you've got discrimination, you've got prejudice, you can even say bigotry at the individual level. And then at that group level, you've got racism. Now, honestly, Angela, I agree with you. Like in everyday discourse, there is no reason to have that conversation. If people want to continue thinking of racism that way, they can. But I think the reason why scholars went in that direction was because it was actually more accurate. I mean, to put a point on it, and then I'll stop because I think I've been talking more than anyone else. Imagine a slave, and this is hyperbole, but this is to get to the point. Imagine a slave saying, you know what, I hate that white man. Is that racism now? I mean, that person has no power.
Right.
Is he being a little bit bigoted? Probably.
But Rod, you're just presupposing that your definition is the right definition, and what happens is you get to a point where it's just base assumptions going against one another. There's you can't go out and find the objective definition of racism in nature. Like these are ideas that we associate with terms and argue over.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just thinking of it from a practical standpoint, like. Right. Yes, the slave doesn't have any power against, that white person.
So is a slave racist?
So, but I would say yes, because they're still thinking their thought on the basis of race. And that just makes sense. It makes sense to call that racism. Yeah. And if you want to
objectively racism, it's okay. It's understandable that he's saying that.
Right. And you can call it
fine.
You can say it's obviously it's ineffectual, right? He's not, that white person is not going to be probably even remotely bothered by it because it's meaningless. But the thought, the way we're going to describe that idea, it makes sense to call it racism because that is the fundamental difference between what's happening in that moment versus any other kind of bigotry and any other kind of discrimination, of which there are many. Right? There's so many different kinds of discrimination and bigotry and prejudice. But the one that is specifically on the basis of racial categorization makes sense to give it the name racism. And like Sam pointed out, we can have the systemic racism. We define it as that situation that you were talking about where a dude racialized as black cannot get a job anywhere because of, that perceived race category.
I'm sorry, y'all, but we're not even talking about CRT at this point. That's my problem with this whole conversation. You want to have a conversation about race, let's have a conversation about race. We're not having a conversation about CRT. And the fact that we're also having a conversation trying to get at the individual, how I feel as an individual in guise of a system, that's disingenuous. Because you can say this is what it feels like to me, right, as a white person, but the reality is you will not have the same experience as a black person in this country. It don't matter. It will never happen. And the concept that we can't have that conversation, to me, is flawed. It's saying we don't want that to happen, but it's happening. And so we're having this like.
Wait, can you clarify what?
Yeah, how are we not? Okay.
What specifically you were referring to? Which conversation?
That that whiteness and blackness happens in America. A white person gets treated differently than black people in America. Period.
Oh yeah, they
Period.
do.
Did we say otherwise?
Yeah, I don't
But
think
that's my point. What you're trying to
disagrees.
say is that individual difference can still be classified as racism because it's an individual difference. I don't agree with that at all. What I'm saying is, in this country, we as a whole know that white people get treated better and differently than black people in this country as a whole. If you want to take that down to like, oh, my one white experience with a black person being mad at me because I'm white, fine. But that's not racism, not in the true context of the words.
But
it's racism in the true context of the word, but we need to clarify. What you're doing is having the traditional definition is what you just said. You're saying the traditional definition is the wrong definition, right?
Well, the traditional definition includes both. The first definition that I was able to find in an American dictionary, had the sort of race prejudice aspect first, but then it also had the application of kind of racist
policies,
beliefs in policies, or a society that reflects racist beliefs and policies as well. So even if there's no one individually racist in the society on that definition, you could still call the society racist in terms of the inequitable outcomes. And I've always found that dual aspect that Charles describes in the excerpt of the book that I was reading, where he says, well, look, racism has always been talked about in both interpersonal and institutional contexts.
I think that's fair. And I think the institutional context is important. It's important what to talk about. I guess, on the ground, day to day, what people are mainly used to experiencing or talking about is the person to person thing. And the systemic thing is more abstract.
And that's the problem to me. That's the problem to me.
I do agree.
That's the reduction down to that is the problem. Because that goes back to what I said earlier. This is about what happens to me as an individual with no concept about our society and how that operates. And so that is why we're having this debate around CRT in schools, because we're caring about that one kid who you don't want that child to experience racism while the other kid in that same room is. And you're going to pretend like that's not happening. That's a fundamental problem in this conversation, because you're also in that moment catering to one child over another. And that's where that individualism problem exists. And if we're going to have the CRT conversation to just talk about whiteness and blackness, we might as well just have the conversation about, let's talk whiteness and blackness, because the rest of the conversation that's really built around that, which is being sort of where this is being put under CRT, doesn't exist. It shouldn't even be put under CRT. CRT is over here. We're having a completely separate conversation right here. And to me, that is our problem, because you want to keep having this like individual conversation. Well, this is the way someone sees it. This is the way this person sees it. Just because someone doesn't have the intellectual savvy enough to know the distinctions between that does not give them a pass.
But I prefaced in the email that I'm not going to be completely focused on CRT, like Derrick Bell's version of CRT, because I feel like the conversation going on generally in America is more about our polarizing viewpoint on how to handle and discuss race and racism at all. And so that's cloaked under CRT. So while one person is talking about Derrick Bell, someone else is talking about something they saw in an article somewhere that has nothing to do with Derrick Bell, but it's called CRT. So that's why I'm trying to have this
called CRT. We should tell them right now in this moment, if we're going to have this conversation, we need to say out loud, this is not CRT. We are having a conversation about the way individuals are operating in a country that is racist, because it treats one group of people differently than another group. That conversation is a conversation we can have. But if you're not willing to at least own up to the first part of it, then we can't get there, because we're still dealing with people's individual framework of their one little moment in society as if they're not a part of society, as if even their actions is not the actions of which they're being imposed upon because of society, as well as their existence that incorporates into society. They're not walking around here by themselves. They're incorporated with their family, the community, the schools, and everything else in between. So the concept that my one individual thing is still more important than our society fundamentally is the flaw. That's the flaw I hear in this conversation.
Wasn't the question, about a definition of racism and whether a Black person can be racist? Weren't we answering that question?
Whether or not white people can be seen as racist.
Yeah.
Can racism happen to white people?
Right. We were talking about that, right? We were answering that question.
And I don't agree with the question, but the same way I'm saying it.
You don't have to.
A society that benefits the white people, and we all know it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm asking that question. Well, it was a viewer's question, but I wanted to ask that because when I have my own conversations, that comes up all the time, and I feel like it needs to be answered in some type of way. So, and just to not answer it, it's just sweeping stuff under the rug, and that it just should be answered. Can they? Do they? And if someone here that's white has felt like they've been treated in a racist way, should just say it, and we can discuss it.
They've been prejudged and they have been discriminated against, but they have not experienced racism.
So that's the issue, right? Go ahead.
That's the issue.
Maybe Will should talk.
No.
Well, maybe Will should say something.
Will, yeah, Will.
Oh yeah, Will, you have to
real quick.
go.
Yeah, I do have to go in 10 minutes. But I guess my question with the prejudice versus power, the power is the scale of it. Because you could be a white kid in an all-Black neighborhood, and you are at a power. It just depends on how big the scale. Are we talking about a scale like nationwide, worldwide? Because that matters. If you're a white person, maybe in certain situations, then you wouldn't have as much power. If you're Tyler Perry and you have a whole studio and you say, I'm not going to hire any white actors, and it's a white kid who's from just working class, who has more power in that dynamic? That's my question, is how big of a scale are we talking about here? Because power can exist in different kind of scales.
But that white kid can get a job anywhere else in the industry, anywhere else in the industry.
Maybe.
But the Black kids can't, and that's the difference. Especially dark Black children.
Children. I'm very confused right now.
Kids.
That's actually correct. That there's a colorism issue in
Tyler Perry's argument. The argument about Tyler Perry.
Yeah.
He was trying to say Tyler has control over a studio and decides he doesn't want to hire a white kid. Right? That white kid can get work in any other part of the industry.
So you scale it out to all studios.
Yes.
That's what I'm talking about, scale. Like within that one studio though, like that which is pretty big. So just how big are we talking about here? Like, is it just within a nation? That's my question.
Well, that's a good academic question that would need to be fleshed out. I don't actually have a problem with those kind of questions. That's what we're supposed to do. So you start with the general premise that we're working at a macro level, and then you ask these questions about, okay, how does it play out? I want to say two things here. And then I think I've said what I need to say about racism here. It's important to realize that if you're trying to understand how these really heinous acts occur, you cannot look at individuals. You cannot compare a Jewish man in Weimar Germany with a Germany man in Weimar Germany and say, well, gosh, both of them hate each other. So, see, there you go. It's just a problem in the country. No, you have to look at what group is in power, because that will then determine whether or not they're able to institute certain things that we think are bad. So, okay, fine. If you want to talk, everyday level outside about the definition and whatnot, fine. But a scholar will have to look at the phenomena and explore it in that sense. And so I want to ask you guys, why are we assuming that either the definition doesn't change or the phenomena doesn't change? Like, are things always static? I mean, it seems ridiculous. I mean, chivalry today means something different than 300 years ago. We're not laying, or 400 years ago, we're not laying swords in front of women now to be chivalrous. What are we doing? We're opening the door. So what I'm saying is we don't have to stick with the same definition forever, the same description. So
one thing that Rod said that I think that I definitely agree with is in terms of the, you have to look at the context. If Will had to leave, or that's sad. You have to look at the context.
He had to go.
Yeah. Because, so just grant for a second, imagine we say, okay, white people can experience racism. Then the next question is, do white people experience racism at anywhere near the rate or magnitude
Right.
of black people or other people
Yeah.
of color in this country? And the answer is inevitably, as long as you're looking at things like responsibly, no, they don't. So can we focus on the racism that's doing a lot more damage, please? Like, like, so you could just concede and say, yeah, sure, white people can face racism if you want to define racism as you're committed to defining it, right? Because people don't like to change their minds about definitions a lot. So you can say, look, if you want to think about racism that way, then sure, on your definition, white people can be the victims of racism. Uh, has that racism ever threatened your life? Has that racism ever Does that racism impact you in a way that makes you likely to have a shorter lifespan? Like let's look at the real impactful things, and then if they're not just bad faith participants in the conversation, maybe it can go somewhere.
Right. Yeah, and I agree with that. The difference may be that, one racism matters a lot more than the other racism. So let's just focus on what we need to focus on. I think that was well said, Sam.
But I guess it's good that we had this exchange, in my opinion, because it's not a frivolous question and it's not an unrelated question. Because our answer to that question that Brittany posed that started this whole go round is going to affect the way that we go into, creating curricula and how we apply it and how we deal with people who start to object to that curricula. So, it matters, right? So if we're just like, well, you know what? Yeah, you might feel like we're being racist against you right now, but in the grand scheme of things, it's inconsequential and we're just not going to give you that much attention, for example. If that's the attitude that someone is coming in with, yeah, that can be an understandable attitude when you think of it, at scale and you go, yeah, I'm trying to address the real big problems here. But that's not going to make too much of a difference in the individual experience of that kid or the individual experience of the parent who's concerned with that kid, right?
Yeah.
They may be right or wrong, but that's going to be something you're going to have to negotiate. That's going to be something you're going to have to deal with. And I think that there are ways to do it where you can avoid having that problem in the first place.
But see,
We
my
can,
problem with that, oh, he's coming back. My problem with that, just so that we're clear, is that a lot of what's happening in this moment, and particularly with this, even some of the last few things I've seen, like I just looked at the Tennessee principals one, what it presupposes is that any instance that that white kid is uncomfortable, that's grounds for case. And that's where I have a problem, because that supposition is not granted to the children in the room, and it's not granted to the children who were called the N-word by that child.
sure. Well, but I mean, maybe the solution isn't to go in that direction, but the other direction. Maybe the solution is we shouldn't, to the extent that that's allowed, we should be actively changing it so that any individual kid who is being treated that way has a case. Because, and I don't mean legally, I don't know, that whole thing is a mess.
I mean, there's a lot of that. That's the problem about this conversation.
Yeah,
and which is like it gets put under that umbrella that it's not. But but my problem is a lot of those things were put in place because there were a group of kids caught on video saying the N-word, and the other kids who heard it had a case against that, and then the parents pushed back because it was fine for them to have their kids say the N-word. And that's the problem. And until we can wrap our head around that part, because if you're saying that those kids have a defense because the Black kids pushed back about being called the N-word, then we're fundamentally not having the same conversation. We're actually back where we were.
Yeah, I mean, I think the double standard is the problem. And if there's a double standard, we shouldn't have it. So, there are a bunch of different ways we can approach that. We can, flip the double standard around, or we can try to correct it so that there is no double standard. It just depends. And, the circumstance that you're talking about, I'm absolutely in agreement with you. But I think there are many circumstances that are not exactly what you described, and it matters. So, you know, those details change things. And the thing is that while I fully agree that when we're talking about at scale, when we're talking about the systematic problems, there's clearly a greater concern versus, you know, some of the others, right? There's a clear number one concern. But that's not going to make much of a difference for a parent whose number one concern is their child. And no matter what color that child is, they care about their kid and they don't want to send their kid to school to experience something that they feel is distressing to their child. Whether they're right or wrong about that, whether they're overcorrecting, whether they're exaggerating, you know, overreacting, whatever, that's still the situation. And I think how we communicate with those people in those circumstances is really important if we're trying to get something done here. That's my perspective.
And my only pushback
Okay,
on that is that just really quickly, Brittany, I'm sorry.
Oh no.
Is that even in that school, if the school is majority white, we know what that scale actually looks like. If that school happens to be majority black, we could have a different conversation about that. But the fact that we can say at scale, we know that kids are treated differently, but then in the school, it's that one kid instead of the scale that's in that school, then we are having a fundamental disconnect. So you put those policies in place that basically says everybody's equal when we actually know that is not true. And that treatment.
I'm sorry. Yeah, just if I could just jump in, I have a class to teach in like 3 minutes, but I think CRT, like the problem with labeling this stuff critical race theory, like critical race theory can be used to highlight that the war on drugs is systemically racist. And I use that example a lot as like from John Ehrlichman all the way through to the results and everything like that. You can do Yickwo versus Hopkins. And like there's these things that aren't racist on the front, but they are racist, even though it's not like objectively right in front of you. But you can call it a widget, whatever it is. I think a lot of parents, and I talk to a lot through FAIR and through these different teachers I talk to, it's when we get to the really extreme stuff. My friend Paul Rossi, who was fired for basically wanting to bring in Glenn Lowry into his classroom and stuff like that, because it would confuse the kids. And there's this weird stuff whenever whiteness is brought up and the segregation. There's like crazy stuff going on in classrooms right now. And call it whatever. I'm fine with just getting rid of calling it CRT. I know Chris Rufo really hammers that nail. I'm fine with getting rid of it, but whatever it is, it's bad. And I think we can hopefully agree that that the way that some of this is being done by some teachers is bad. And I'm looking for common ground all the time. I just want to more focus on that because I'm focused on solutions. And it just seems like it's not really aiming at that. It's very vague and stuff like that in classrooms. That's just something that I wanted to contribute.
I was going to ask this. I'm not a parent. I'm not a mother, but I was taught, about Jim Crow and American slavery when I was younger, and CRT was not brought up. None of this was brought up, obviously, but I was uncomfortable in class. White kids were uncomfortable in class, like talking about American slavery and Jim Crow and seeing your color people, whatever it is, in a field, seeing Black people in a field and saying these were slaves. That was uncomfortable for me. And then white people seeing the slave masters look like them, that's uncomfortable for them. So this notion of people being uncomfortable or kids being uncomfortable, I mean, isn't it going to be uncomfortable talking about those things? Like, it's not anything, and it's inevitably going to happen. Like, you can't get away from that. So I don't understand why we're like, well, we don't want them to feel this way and them to feel this way. Okay, but both sides are saying American slavery should be taught, Jim Crow should be taught, etc. Those are going to make kids uncomfortable, period. So
can I just add one bit to what you said? Because I often hear this idea, and it was expressed earlier, I think by Will, that everyone agrees that the history of racism should be taught. Not everybody agrees. There's actually some recent polls in the Washington Post. I can pull them up. I brought screenshots because I thought they would be important to bring up at some point. So one asks, how much do you think public schools should teach about how the history of racism affects America today? And the majority of Republicans, 53% of Republicans, said either they should not teach that so much or they should teach it not at all. 92% of Democrats said either a good amount or a great deal. So and out of all adults, the answers combined don't teach at all how the history of racism affects America today, or don't teach that so much. All adults over 25%. So it's not some fringe minority. And then a differently worded one asks, and this one's not about how history affects America today, which you could see as being maybe more contentious because people were like, well, you have different ideological lenses through which you view history and, the causal patterns. Maybe you're an individualist, right? Or, whatever. This one just says, do you approve or disapprove of public schools teaching about the history of racism? And 43% of Republicans opposed, they disapproved. 1/3, this was the most popular answer among Republicans, 34% of them said that they disapproved strongly of public schools teaching about the history of racism. So these are very recent polls because people are interested.
When exactly?
Yeah.
I was about to ask when.
Like within the past month, each of them came
May I
out.
ask? May I ask what age these kids are? I mean, are they talking about K through 12?
They weren't
period,
polling children; they were polling adults.
What about what age group?
One of them specifically named K through 12 schools. I remember. The other, I can't remember whether it did or didn't.
I want to say something about, if I may, before you say something, Shireen. I want to go back to what Brittany said about being uncomfortable, and this is me being a critical scholar. I'm not really, but I'm being a critical scholar in a way by saying, look, it boils down to the fact that we see Black people as a race, and when they have faults, then we can talk about them, and that's okay. But if we talk about the normative group or include them in that, then all of a sudden people go gaga. I remember my mother got a master's in public health, I think. I'm sorry, bachelor's. And so she had been away from school for a long time. So anyway, she's in this these classes, and they're consistently talking about the negative outcomes of Black people. And so we're having a conversation, and she just comes out and says, one time, why are all these bad things happening to Black people? I mean, in a way, I guess it was like mildly traumatic to her to finally realize these things are going on. This is the norm. We're always talking about these sort of maladies or dysfunctions amongst people of color, and it's fine. But the minute we turn that lens ever so slightly to the things that might affect white Americans, then all of a sudden you've got these groups forming that want to say, well, this is just ideology, and they're propagating this idea that white people are being indoctrinated, or I'm sorry, children are being indoctrinated and all this stuff, and it's not even accurate. And before I, because I think Shireen was going to say something, I'm turning the narrative a little bit, and maybe the lens around to a lot of these groups that are talking about these issues. In my opinion, if those groups were not there, the Rufos of the world and all these other groups that have started in supposed reaction to social justice, we would not have this problem. But they create the intellectual fodder necessary for that uncomfortable parent or that politician maybe to use it and say, now we have a reason to not talk about whiteness or race or anything in school, because you see, these very smart people say that this is bad.
I don't know about that.
That's my conspiracy.
I don't know about that.
I mean, you have to admit, look, if I talk to people and ask them, what's going on in schools? What's happening here? I do have a small, I do talk to people, and they'll tell me, I don't know what's happening, man. And then when you ask someone, they'll point to some anecdote somewhere, or they'll go to some site where, like New Discourse or something, where all of this literature is being produced about all of these evils. Then you go into a classroom and it's really not there. You do have some things going on, right. Really. You do have things going on, but it's a moral panic, basically. You push this thing up into something that's not really there. And that's actually the real problem.
So you
It's
think
not that it's not
exaggerated?
really there.
Yeah,
It's
it's
that it's
there.
exaggerated. Exactly. It's like
No,
because a few
but it's
isolated instances will
Exactly.
happen on anything.
Anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
See,
And
there's
then
always-
It's there, and it may be exaggerated in certain situations, especially when it comes to politicians. But I don't think it's so exaggerated. I think it's still big enough that it's a problem. We still
A
need to be
problem for
talking
who,
about it.
though? Like,
What's
what
that?
exactly?
The white
I don't know. I don't have any evidence. In my opinion, we're more tolerant than ever. And these social justice initiatives have been going on for at least 20 years, probably more, where we've been talking
60.
about
Yeah.
where we've been talking about these things for a long time. We are the most tolerant we've ever been. So what, you want to change that now? Because a few
No.
white people are uncomfortable?
No, I think it's the other way. I think it's we're the most tolerant now, and some people are trying to take us back.
No,
I don't
the
agree
things
with that
we've
at
been
all.
doing have made us
I don't
more
agree with that
tolerant.
at all.
The things we've done have made us more tolerant.
Absolutely not. What's happening is the whole thing that you're talking about, take us back. No. They want to make sure that their children does not get held accountable for their actions when they're being racist toward Black and brown children. It's supposed to be accepted because it's been accepted.
That's
Who's
That
they?
is-
Who's they
Yeah.
there? Because
I mean,
I do my legwork too. I talk to people too. I travel and talk to people.
South Lake, Texas, they. South Lake, Texas, they. I've tracked it. I've watched it. I documented it. They want their children to be able to say the N-word without being punished.
That's very
So
bad.
much so
okay.
that they changed the school board so that can happen. When we are denying that take back, we can't.
I'm not denying that happens. I'm saying I believe you when you're saying that happens. Right. It's not. You're saying they like capital T, like it's happening in every school district.
But listen,
the words of
listen to what I'm saying though. That's where the CRT debate starts from, because it's those parents who did not want for diversity curriculums to come into their schools because their children were caught calling Black children N-words. That's the group that you can claim is small, but that's the group that's trying to take us back. And that's the group that does not get spoken about enough, because the rest of this conversation is about the fact that those parents are the ones trying to take over the school boards, the same way we had those same parents that didn't want Black kids in their schools during segregation. That's the take back part, Eric. That's the take back part we need to be calling out.
I'll tell you what,
we're not calling it out.
We're being pushed back because those groups are banning books, and that's all because of this moral panic that's been created out of. I grant you, these things do happen. So these idiosyncratic instances, anecdotes, you get these organizations started saying, "Oh, there's a big problem," and so now you're starting to ban books. That's actually where the racism is coming in.
I don't think those organizations started out of nowhere, just poof, magically they just appeared.
No, they came from Republicans with money.
No, I mean, come on. I mean,
I can tell you where they came from.
There are absolutely parents who were reacting to something that was going on, and enough of it started happening, and the conversation around it was so toxic and unproductive that they felt the need to create some kind of opposition. And, this is part of the issue here. And, Shireen, I do not doubt at all the truth in what you're saying at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. But I think we run into issues when we are, like Eric just said, capital T, they, when we say capital T, they about this particular thing, but then we're going to go lowercase t, they, with the things that Rod is talking about, where both of you are right and both of you are wrong, because that's not, there's a lot going on. It's a big country and there's a lot happening. And the way we talk about it is incredibly unproductive. It's incredibly polarized and disingenuous, dishonest, and divisive, and unnecessarily so. It does not need to be this way.
I don't agree. You know why I don't agree? Because the problem that we're having is that we don't want to hold people accountable for their actions. And then we're angry. Then we're angry when those who speak up do so. That's why the banning books thing comes from. I'm not disagreeing with you, Angel, that there are people who feel like something went wrong, right? But some of those people, what went wrong is there's too many brown kids in my school with my child.
Yeah,
that
and I'm with you.
Part
I'm 100% with you there.
is a problem. And if we can't call that part of the problem out, we can't solve this, because if it's just about, oh my God, let's not talk about whiteness anymore, when what Brittany just said, that's impossible if you're actually going to teach slavery. Because if you actually teach slavery, you're going to see a skin color difference. That's when you said it earlier. I was like, how is everyone saying let's talk about history, but then pretend that Jim Crow and slavery aren't a perfect example of where you're identified as Black and identified as white? How do you teach that and then pretend like those two things aren't going to come up in part of the conversation? And
I don't recall when we said that.
Well, it just depends. It depends. I mean, you can absolutely teach these things and discuss these things honestly without, or while also taking great care to ensure that no one that you're teaching it to picks up the idea that they are the avatar for any of this stuff, that they are an avatar for any of it on either side of it.
You can try.
Group
that is impossible.
You can try.
When I look at a TV show, when I look at a TV show and I see teens, freshman teens, and they all white, those teens do not match my avatar. I see a TV show about white teens. Okay. When I see a TV show about Black teens growing up in Harlem, I see an avatar of me.
No. So what I mean is, part of the problem is we're talking about, this is what white people did. This is how awful white people were. These are the awful things white people have done to Black people, right?
Are we talking about it? Well, I mean, like, some people are talking about it on Twitter, but like, is that happening in classroom conversations?
I don't think that's happening.
Yeah, it is.
Like, I know it happens. It's happened at least once, right? Of course, because you can find examples. But like, but like, when you say it's happening, right? It implies a kind of like regular.
I'm trying to illustrate the concept that I'm pointing out, which is basically.
But you're doing the same way, which you were asking me about, and I can give you the perfect example.
No. Right? I'm not pointing fingers here. I'm just saying this is a way that we can approach this, right? We can say, look, this isn't you. You didn't do this, but these are the categories that were created. These are the effects of the categories that were created. These are the remnants of those effects. This stuff matters, and it's incredibly important that we all understand it. Every one of us has to understand it, right? But you are not the embodiment of that. You are not responsible for it. You didn't do it. And
critical race theory.
And look, I'm not a Rufo guy, right? I'm not just full blast anti-CRT, even actual CRT, like the actual, critical race theory, not, MTV CRT. But yeah, I just mean, again, all of my focus is on how we're communicating this, because it matters. These things are important. It really matters that everyone is on the same page and understands what we're trying to do here, because what we're trying to do here is a good thing at bottom. That is a good thing. We're trying to highlight something that is wrong and that has been wrong and that we need to fix. But we get into so much trouble and unnecessary kind of squabbles, and it turns into this completely unnecessarily toxic discourse because of the way that we engage with it and the way that we turn it into this team thing. I mean, I don't look at it that way. I see it as, look, we need to understand this. We, all of us. I'm not talking about people who look like me. I'm not talking about people who have the same amount of melanin. I'm talking about everybody. We, because we are here together. That's what matters to me. That's what I'm trying to do here.
I don't think we're going to find any evidence in the next 10 or 15 years that the kids who are going through our school system now are going to be more racist. I just don't. I don't see how that could happen by recognizing how race impacts other people's lives. In fact, I think that we're seeing more, well, this is not kids now, but young people and more interracial marriages. Young people, I think, are more integrated, although adults, there's still a lot of segregation. So I just don't see that. And so I see this as really a political thing where you've got folks, two types, I believe, that there's a small percentage of people, maybe us here, who, see colorblind as a political value, and they would like to colorblindness, and they would like to continue that. And they see that these initiatives now are an affront to that. Okay, that's the tip, or the first, or the top layer. Underneath that is a mass of people who stick their thumb to the wind and they see, wow, all these diversity initiatives. Oh, what is this? All this platforming of African Americans and what? This Native American history. What's going on? Amazon has this thing up here about Black Lives Matter. I don't like this. And they glam on to whatever it is they can to push back against that. And this anti-CRT movement is one of those things. And I think that we are missing that whole thing. I mean, that's what's powering this, because I agree with Sam that this is really not happening in so many places, and it's not hurting so many people that it requires this much conversation. It only gets that because it helps people who don't like this diversity stuff.
I think it's interesting what anecdata is able to be scaled out and what anecdata is not. And I feel like it really depends on what argument you're making, because, you know, a few isolated incidents, in the words of Sam Hoadley-Brill, are of course going to happen, but we need to respond appropriately to those few isolated incidents. But then on the other hand, a few isolated incidents like what Shireen is talking about need to be responded to in a different way, right? I mean, I don't know what the numbers are in terms of like how prevalent one thing is versus the other. But I think both are worthy of concern. Both things should be addressed. We can hold those two things in our heads at the same time, and we can address them honestly. And I feel like so much enmity will be resolved if we just go, yeah, like just go, yeah, that's awful. I agree with you. That's terrible. We shouldn't do that. What can we do to fix that part? Instead of saying that's not a problem, which is what everyone does to each other. You know,
I agree. It would be better if, instead of blunt dismissals, people took a second to acknowledge and validate, because some people really are just looking for their feelings to be validated. But it hasn't been my experience that once that happens, and then I say, okay, well, let's assess which of these problems is worth more time talking about, right? Like, let's look at some survey data, like how many teachers in states with anti-CRT legislation now are going to avoid talking about these kinds of issues just out of a fear of the security of their job. And like, there's surveys conducted on that sort of thing. Like, whenever we want to look at the large scale, we're going to have to do social science and move out of the realm of anecdotes. Now, anecdotes aren't useless, but then once we move past the anecdotes, we have to look at the data. And I'm very confident that the data, because all of the data that I've seen, like, bears out the fact that teachers are not teaching white students to hate themselves because of their race. Like, I can't imagine, like, it's unfathomable, the disparity of number of anecdotes in one case to like the actual data, and in the other case, like, there are so many instances that, like, you can poll students on what they think the cause of the Civil War is, and something like 50% say something other than slavery. Like, that is a huge, like, compared to, okay, well, how many students are taught to hate themselves because they're white? You know, like, and maybe you don't think those are the same in magnitude, sure, but like, there's all sorts of, like, it's a much more nuanced conversation. And I find that the people, if I validate their concerns about these anecdotes, oh yeah, that anecdote is pretty shitty, they just move on to another one, and they're like, well, but what about this one? What don't you got to condemn that one too? And it's like, we got a limited amount of time on Earth. Like, we can only talk about so many things.
Yeah, that's fair.
My problem
I think as long as we acknowledge that this isn't a phenomenon that happens in only one direction, you know, either side does this.
I think
it's a mistake to say that the anti-CRT movement is entirely a right-wing reaction to integration. I think
that would be oversimplified.
Yeah, I think that's a mistake. I don't want to do that. The word nuance is key here. It should be said in all caps at all times.
Oh, no, it's not integration. It's more this general push towards platforming people of color, and it creates a sense of precarity in a lot of people who are not a person of color, and they say, what's going on here?
Right, but then you have all the people who don't.
It shouldn't be called.
You have all the people who don't fall into that category.
It shouldn't be called CRT. You're right.
First of all, it should not be called CRT at all. First,
right.
The second part of that is that my problem is that what I would rather have is data on how many times white children have been held accountable for their racist actions that this garnered these reactions from, versus how many times Black and brown children had to experience racist actions.
Okay, yeah.
That's the data set I want to have so that we can have a true conversation. But in my opinion, what we're having conversations about is the all of a sudden concern for white children in this space, that somehow what Sam just said, that like that other teachers are just going up, you should feel horrible because you're white, because you were born white. I don't know which example of that have I seen, but what I have seen though is a white child calling a Black child the N-word.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. So like that's the part that we're not talking about. And
I think we talk about
part,
we talk about that all the time.
I think we talk about it a lot.
And the other part is the concerns that we are seeing in schools right now, because we are moving to a level of segregation, because the schools, including like what I've been seeing in New York City, they don't want Black children in certain schools. So that part is becoming a part of CRT. And that is a problem, right? So when you want to find ways to segregate Black children, or you're concerned that too many Black children are in your schools, we need that data set too. And there's a lot of disconnect about the fact that that is part of it. Like the school where the valedictorian and salutatorian were both Black, and they made the school go back.
And so they changed
it. Yeah, that's bullshit.
A white kid and both have additional. If we are in an equal society, why can't that school have two Black salutatorian and valedictorians? Why not? Why is that a shock? Why does that mean the school has to go back and make sure that now that there are two salutatorians and two valedictorians?
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Come on.
There are some complicating factors here, right? Not everyone who is opposed to this stuff belongs to the racial category of white, right? And not everyone who is opposed to this stuff would say, I am opposed to platforming, Black people or centering Black voices or any of that stuff. I don't think that's true. I think that it's way more complicated than that. I think that it gets down to specific ideas and specific methodologies that are being employed in one case or another, maybe not across the board, whatever, but those are things that other people object to. They say, hey, I feel like there are these and these consequences to taking this approach. And, we can hand wave that stuff. We can say, oh yeah, well, you're just, whatever I literally was accused of cooning yesterday. So, I mean, you know what I mean? Like there are productive and unproductive ways to address these things, but it's not simply just a right-wing white people, trying to hold desperately on to their power thing. That's not all that's happening here. Sure, that's part of it. Some of that is the case, but that is not 100% of what's happening here. And it does matter that there are voices.
But to me, the percentage is what matters.
Well,
you have so many. I mean, whether the anti-CRT folks like it or not, they are certainly providing intellectual fodder for that growing far right Republican Party that's looking for reasons to maybe not go to the era of Jim Crow, but they're certainly unhappy with this platforming of non-white people. They would not see it as racist. They would see it as racist to them. They would say that they're being victimized.
Yeah, that's bound to happen. That's bound to happen. And it could happen in the other way too. So are you saying that those people who are in good faith talking back at CRT, they shouldn't talk because a Republican's going to use it? Because I don't think that's the way to go.
I'm saying that if you've already started by exaggerating these instances, I think the anti-CRT thing is a political project in itself. It's based on color blindness. It's just not a Republican project. But you've got this political project where you want to put certain values in schools about color blindness. Okay, fine. But it's based on an exaggerated on anecdotes that we don't think necessarily conforms to reality. And then it's used to help the far right party, far right Republicans. Sure, yeah, you got to take some blame on that. I'm not sure how you address it.
I'm never going to talk again. I'm never going to talk again.
You got to figure out how to.
Something.
Well, you got to figure out how to address
color is
that.
blue. Some Republicans are going to use that.
Hey, we're talking about communication this whole time, about how to communicate stuff. So I'm just turning it back.
I think, but I think, my objections to this specific idea or this specific approach to dealing with, the idea of race in our society are no less valid just because some crazy right winger is going to take that and go, aha, see, this person who's brown is, agrees with them. That's nonsense. That's not
the CRT person can say the same thing. I'm trying to teach
everybody,
but we're not the ones casting aspersions in that way, kind of doing this, moral pollution thing of just
this is a political analysis. This is not casting aspersions. I'm just pointing out the reality of things. Now, how you want to deal with that is fine.
But you said
I'm just pointing out
you did say that we have to take some of the blame there.
Oh,
and
sure.
I say,
just like that teacher.
Absolutely
okay, so
not.
that teacher. So then that teacher who's trying to teach about whiteness shouldn't take any blame for when the child is a little uncomfortable. Come on now.
No, but we're not talking about blame. We're talking about, hey, this is an unintended consequence.
Okay, so the CRT person unintended consequence.
You're talking about methodology and not content. You're saying that we have to basically silence ourselves because somebody might use it.
I'm saying that you got to take. I am saying that you got to take. I'm saying the same thing you're saying about CRT. Listen, I'm saying that you're communicating something that has an effect. Now you can decide. You can decide how you want to deal with that effect. I'm telling you that it really helps. Probably more than what you think you're helping deal with some kind of racial issues here to make people less racist. I'm saying it's actually making people more racist. Now you may not necessarily agree with that analysis, but there it is.
Okay.
Now you can modify that communication to do.
Are you trying to do the opposite of what Angel said, which is that basically if we don't have that nuance of getting that little distinction out and understand the both sides of it, and you're using the Republican side as that part, is that what you're doing, Rod? Because that's what it sounds like.
Maybe.
I mean, look,
like it's like Angel was like, we got to communicate. We got to make sure that communication is happening. But in that communication, you have to also admit that some of that communication is letting white ring people use it as an example.
Sure. But if someone is cynically or dishonestly using an objection that I have that is an honest one, that is a well-intentioned one, I'm trying to make it easier for us to have this conversation. I'm trying to make it easier for these things to happen the way we want, because we want to teach about racism. We want to teach, our children what the structure of American society actually is like, right? But I have an objection with this particular approach. If someone dishonestly or cynically uses that objection for their political purposes, how can I be responsible for that behavior? It's not my fault that I have an objection, and it's not my fault that they're dishonestly using that objection.
So the CRT teachers then?
Yes, but what I can do is say, I don't agree with what this guy's doing with my objection, right? But the implication, Rod, in what you said is, hey, every time you object, you're giving them more fuel, and you should think about that. What's going on underneath that is, so shut up. That's really what's happening.
Yeah. No, that's what you're saying. That's what you're saying.
What is the inevitable response otherwise?
Let Sam get into this.
Okay, go ahead.
I think I can help here, because I don't think Rod is trying to say like that you're responsible for like how someone twists your words or manipulates your ideas to their own negative purposes. What I think, and maybe you are saying that, Rod, but here let me try a different idea, right? Or an idea, because I think you'll agree with this, Rod, is that, well, look, like, again, right? There's a finite amount of time, a finite amount of things we can emphasize, and we're in the middle of, or, we're now in the thick of, like, who knows when this is going to end. But when it really started to pick up, when Fox News was saying critical race theory 1,500 times, in a couple months, when you have Ted Cruz going on and saying that it's just as bad as the KKK. You have DeSantis introducing something in his Florida Department of Education to ban critical race theory. You have all these politicians now rallying around this, as everyone here has admitted, it's not critical race theory, right? They've used this term that they knew was going to scare white Americans and other Americans too, but primarily, white Americans, because it sounds spooky and academic, and there's already a big current of anti-intellectualism in the Republican Party. When we're in this context and you see, what's going on, you do have to think, okay, now this contribution to the discourse that I'm going to make right now, is that the best use of my time, right? Am I like responsibly contributing to the political climate? And the way I've changed my behaviors in terms of what I like to just talk about, say, on Twitter, since this panic started, because I basically thought to myself, I have so many objections to D'Angelo and Kendi, so many, and I'd like to talk about them because I think that they are, they are given too much credit and they have too much clout. But once the moral panic started, I was like, I don't really want to contribute to all that. I don't want to be someone who's sort of adding to that. Like, that's sort of, I started to think about things in terms of, well, how is this going to be used, right? Like, what is being underemphasized and overemphasized in our political discourse? And I was saying, well, what's being underemphasized? The false nature of this entire moral panic, the extent to which the GOP is again engaged in some, once you look a little closer at things, obvious race-baiting demagoguery. And so I'm going to focus more on shining a light on that than I am on my objections to, the two bestsellers of last summer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a more articulate way of saying what I was saying. I just want to point out, though, this thing, we started talking about the definition of racism, and someone on this panel said, look, the reality is this is how people think about it. So we need to talk about it in productive ways. In other words, understand your audience and the impact of your communications. That's what I took from that. I am simply making the same argument here. So those anti-CRT folks, they may get their way and CRT is banned. And along the way, they're going to also help the Republican Party, particularly the far right, ban books and take a lot of race and diversity initiatives and all these other things out of our institutions. That's what's going to happen. So so they'll get what they want, maybe, but then this will also help these other things happen. That's just the reality.
They want, yeah. Sorry,
understanding one's audience is a contextual endeavor. There's no way. I mean, if you're speaking to a group of people and what you say to them gets out, that's that. You can't do anything about that. You can address the audience in front of you accordingly. You can understand the general discourse they're immersed in and take that into consideration when you're talking. But once that, I mean, somebody was like, how do you consider audience on Twitter? I'm like, you don't. There's too much going on there. There's too many people there. There's nothing you can do about it. Don't shut up, though. You know what I mean? I
think, yeah, I mean, obviously, yes. But it's also, you can also address the response or the, people running with what you said in a way that you didn't mean. You can point that out.
Yeah.
Right. And you should. You absolutely should.
Yes, you should.
I did that 2 days ago.
But,
yeah.
But there's a problem.
I do it all the time. I have to divorce myself from Chris Rufo constantly.
But
there's a local I'm sorry.
Just really quickly, just I understand where you're trying to go with this. I think, Rod, that's what I was wondering. I figured that you were trying to go back to what Angel was saying. But my problem is that even though you can say what you're saying, it's like, oh, well, this is just our disagreement here. And oops, my camera, sugar, sorry, y'all. And sorry about that.
We can still hear you though.
Yeah. that we can sort of separate this as a Republican situation. But when you actually go back and look at the bills that are written, that are using this in a disingenuous way, I'm sorry, y'all. If you can still hear me, in a disingenuous way, that's also part of the problem, right? Because there's now laws being put in place based on that Republican narrative that was based on the anti-CRT framework that isn't CRT, but allows for things like taking out the taking what paper, like the Federalist Papers, whether those can be in schools or not. Like there's a list of things in here that basically says a teacher cannot discuss current news and affairs, current public policy of social affairs.
It says a teacher cannot be compelled to do that. That's what it says. That's a very different statement.
Well, either way, I think, I agree with you.
May not be compelled, but then if someone says by law, I feel uncomfortable about what the teacher decided to say, then the teacher can be pulled out because that interpretation of the teacher who gave that information, that's the problem. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like, I get the line that you're talking about, but if a teacher does, right? If a teacher actually does, then there's recourse that a parent can have that the teacher did that and may misconstrued in the classroom what the teacher was trying to say and how a child felt. Same thing, Angel. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not for the laws at all because I think laws are blunt tools and we need precision here. And it's a fool's errand. And obviously a lot of cynical and terrible things can get smuggled in there as well. So I'm 100% against those things.
There's a lot of terrible things in this bill.
Yeah, so I've been very vocal about that. I mean, like I was saying a minute ago, I think you can make your objections honestly. So there's a difference, right? There's a difference between we're talking about racism, and we have to understand that the idea most people have in their heads is this idea. And if we're going to try to force them to adhere to a new definition, we have to at least recognize that that's what we need to do, and then clear that ground first in order to communicate effectively, right? There's a difference between that circumstance that I pointed out and this circumstance where someone is taking something you honestly said for honest reasons and using it dishonestly and cynically for terrible reasons. That's a different thing. The dynamic there is different. So while I completely understand that, everything you say can be used can be misused, and you should be mindful of that. And when something, when you have been appropriated and, your objections are being misused, you should point that out. You should say, I'm not allied with this idea. My objection is this, but I'm not cool with this kind of manifestation of it. I think everyone should be doing that. And I think
teachers are being held to a different standard in regards to what you just said, Angel, and that's where the problem is.
Sure. And I think we should all be held to that standard of being honest and pointing out even when our team is being insane. Whatever our team turns out to be, because that just helps. That helps everybody, because this idea of our team is part of the issue as well. I don't see myself as being on one team or the other. We're all here on this same boat. And if we don't figure out how to communicate with each other, live with each other, work with each other, we are doomed. And we can point fingers all we want, but we can't just eject half the population into outer space.
So I want to ask this real quick, because this is a viewer's question and it speaks to where we are in this conversation right now. And it's about being concise. It's about intent on what you say. And this person is asking, do you agree that there's a fundamental problem with the way we understand race because of the language surrounding it? So here's a list of words that people think are polarizing. And this was brought in from the last debate. I went through the comments and questions if people had questions about these terms. And then people have given me these in the last few days. So whiteness and blackness, white privilege, black privilege, woke, anti-woke, white savior, Uncle Tom, black victim, acting white, wanting to be white. There's way more. We don't have time for that. So their question is, are these words basically the fundamental reason why we're so divisive, because they're so polarizing and they almost cause for a fight because they're so subjective and people have their own definitions of it? And do these help at all? Or are they harmful to us?
Well, the well's already been poisoned with so many of those terms, right? And I mean, the best one can do is recognize that and do his or her best to, find some alternative terms, right? And stop saying whiteness and blackness, but still talk about whiteness and blackness. You know what I mean? And this is just the rhetorical considerations you have to take, right? I mean, that's just the way humans work. So if you know this word is going to trigger this person in a certain way, probably shouldn't use that word. You can still talk about those concepts. Probably shouldn't use that word though.
And but what about woke again, and anti-woke? That's the number one thing, because honestly, I will say that.
Do you want my answer to that one?
Yeah, you can go. And we're over time, so I'll be quick. But I have personally intake the people that follow me and who I'm speaking to online, and I have definitely changed words that I use. I have definitely changed language, because I have seen someone, and I won't say who it is, but someone retweeted me and saying basically, yeah, what she's saying is what we should do or whatever. And I'm thinking, I like literally fundamentally disagree with you on everything. And you retweeted me, and I realized my tweet served their narrative. Yeah. So I realized I need to stop using words like woke and anti-woke and these white savior and whatever else. Yeah. So yeah, go ahead, Shireen. I just want to say that.
I fundamentally have a completely different take on that woke thing. Woke is a Black word. Anyone using the anti-woke is saying anti-Black. So if you just choose to use it.
So I'm sorry.
I think woke started. I agree with what you're saying.
But that's the thing, when a word gets hijacked and misused like that, and we don't call it out when it happens, then we're in a whole different conversation. So every time I see anti-woke, what that is, I see a group of white people trying to say something bad about Black people. That's my interpretation. So I want people to understand, you take a vernacular, AAVE of Black people, you twist it to come up with another narrative that's supposed to be anti-AAVE. Come on, y'all.
That's not what's happening.
Well, but
I get her point.
Yeah, could I just point out, Shireen, I agree, like, fundamentally with your point about the racism of the hijacking of the term. Unfortunately, though, there's a lot of people, including a lot of people of color, who just aren't thinking about the history of the terms that they're using.
I know.
Like, right. And so you get this kind of reaction from people who are like, come on, not everyone who's using the terminology intends and that, and it's true, they don't intend it. And I don't think that exonerates them.
It needs to be said though.
Okay, yeah.
White people are woke too, and they get called woke.
Say what?
No, everybody, listen, white women might be the wokest people on the planet.
No, they're not.
All right?
But she's not using it in the same way.
Depending on your definition.
Right.
She's not at all using it in that way.
I know she's not at all using it. I'm saying other people are.
Yeah,
all I'll say,
we have to take that into consideration. It's not saying anti-woke isn't synonymous with saying anti-Black. It's not. It's not. Now, I know woke comes from African American vernacular English. I know where it comes from. I know what it's supposed to mean.
But that's the whole thing about hijacking our language and then pretending like we're not having a conversation about what that really is about. Right. And we can go into debates about it, but that's the way I see it. So when we talk about communication, right? You keep saying it, right? We have these words, like we're saying all of a sudden it's divisive. Just like cancel culture. Cancel culture is what it's about. It's about people being held accountable who don't want to be held accountable.
That's part of it, and then there's a lot of people who are being canceled for bullshit.
Okay, right. But
it is certainly the case.
It's about holding people accountable, and those people do not want to be held accountable.
I said, there's some people are like that. Yes,
so
there are a lot of people who are fine with accountability, who are getting docked.
Wait. Okay, we're moving to cancel culture, but wait. Shireen, that was really insightful. I never thought about thinking of anti-woke as anti-Black. That was not in my head. I had a different view. I saw it as, and I'm always thinking these political ways, as, okay, you had a group of people who didn't like all this social justice. Oh my God, all these people, well, what is this? This doesn't benefit me at all. So they needed to find a way to push back against that. And they tried to make the woke term negative.
It matter, but we'll call it something else.
It was a way to push back against those.
I'm just saying.
progressive ideas that most people think, especially young people, think are positive. So you got people who are older who are like, look, I don't, or white, or heterosexual, or male, it all depends, who just don't like that social justice stuff. And so you got to make woke a bad thing.
So this is actually perfect because Rod and Shireen have both introduced their own definitions for these terms that are being bandied about, right? And they can be right a certain percentage of the time and be wrong a certain percentage of the time. And it's what's great about this is that it's highlighting exactly why these terms are useless and why these terms create more problems than they solve. Because if Shireen, for example, it's you're right, and you absolutely have every right to hold the definition that anti-woke equals anti-black. You can have that in your head, right? And you can respond to anybody who calls themselves anti-woke with that in your head and apply your definition onto them and respond accordingly. Unfortunately, that's going to lead to many, many, many misfires. And you're going to be making enemies of people who would otherwise be 95% on your side or 80% on your side with most things. No, it is true because
no, actually not.
Hold on. It is true because if they have a completely different conception of what anti-woke means than you do, and they're using theirs and they're operating based on theirs, not yours, then you're wrong about them. And it's the same thing with Rod. What Rod is saying is that anti-woke people are by definition, hold on. So what Rod is saying is that anti-woke people are by definition people who don't like social justice movements, social justice endeavors. And if you approach people who call themselves anti-woke with that in mind, you'll be right sometimes, you'll be wrong sometimes. And what's going to happen is you're going to make enemies and you're going to cause unnecessary strife.
Wait a minute. What's the utility of what you're saying?
No.
Because the utility is
I have a response.
Hold on. So my point is that everyone is walking around with their own version of what these things mean and projecting that onto other people who have different versions of what those things mean. And all we're doing is misunderstanding each other. And all we're doing is quibbling over the label when we may actually agree on most of the ideas. On any given encounter, you may actually agree with them on most of the ideas. Maybe their particular objections are reasonable. You don't know. And I'm talking about people who are anti-woke and think this about woke people as well. I'm talking about in any direction. Okay. This is the problem with these terms.
Wait, so what's the solution? Don't use any terms?
The solution is
to listen to other people.
Hold on a second.
The solution
but terms, categories will always arise. It's how people manipulate those categories. You can't say, well, let's not use any categories anymore. That makes sense.
That's not what he said.
But what you can do, but what you can do, and I'm about to wrap up, I'm sorry, but I'm trying to make this point very clear. What you can do is two things. Either, which is the one that I prefer, you can forego these labels because they cause way too much fucking problems and focus on these specific ideas and behaviors.
I'm going to get
addressing.
demonetized, Angel. I'm just kidding.
Okay. So you can focus specifically on the ideas and behaviors in question, right? Get very specific about those things in that moment and forget about putting them under an umbrella. Or you can be very clear about what you mean by that term when you use it before you engage, because then at least the other person has a chance to understand what you're saying to them. Instead of just assuming anti-woke means anti-black, and if you say you're anti-woke, that means you're anti-black. I'm just going to assume that that's what you think, and I'm going to approach you that way.
What does that have to do with
you just summarized chapter 2 of my next books, man. So you gotta give me a blurb or something.
I hope in your book you first start by talking about how the people take these categories and manipulate them.
Yes, they absolutely do.
So
he's
it's
talking
nice.
about that.
Exactly.
No,
no one has a monopoly.
He's not talking about the fact.
About this one.
Exactly.
No one has a monopoly on doing that.
Wait, let's shoot
Any word about social justice will be manipulated. You got to deal with that.
And then you address that manipulation in conversation.
All labels are manipulated. All of them.
I mean, that's fine.
Are you laughing at conversation?
No, I'm laughing at this sort of both sides thing, where instead of saying, look, people manipulated the problem.
Here we go.
They made the problem, and instead of admitting that they made the problem. You're saying, well, both of us have different categories. You don't understand. No, just say, look, dudes took social justice and didn't like it and manipulated it.
I love your impression of me.
All
Shout
right,
out David Blight.
So really quickly,
I'm done. I'm sorry.
Technically, Rod and I's definition is actually pretty close. Like they're almost identical, right?
Okay.
Just so that we're clear.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. I can go right now on Clubhouse and see any anti-woke room. It's a whole bunch of white people in there screaming about what blackness is.
Any room?
That happens.
Candidly. I go right in there really easily and say, y'all full of shit.
A bunch of rooms, sure.
This is what you really mean. Now here's the thing.
See other rooms too.
Here's the thing. When someone uses the word to manipulate so that they can get away with targeting people who are trying to focus on social justice, who predominantly happen to be Black, and you're telling me I gotta walk up to them with my eggshells about how they got there.
No.
We're not on the same page, y'all. We're not.
There's no eggshells going on.
There's no eggshells.
No, seriously. I'm
there's
walking
no
up
eggshells.
to you the way I just said I'm walking up to you. I'm gonna let you know what I know about your interpretation, because what you really mean is
so now
you're mind reading. You're reading people's minds now.
This is what I mean. Is you're going to walk in assuming you know what's in their head.
Out of your mouth after I say that is going to tell me the rest, because most people tell on themselves.
If you want, sure. But what I'm saying is,
and that's how I approach every person.
Sure, it's not eggshells. It's trying to understand where the other person is coming from.
No. I don't walk on eggshells. I'm saying I'm never walking on eggshells.
We're not saying you.
I'm not telling you. I'm telling
them they're anti-Black. Period.
Okay. But you're going to be wrong more often than you're not.
No, I have not been wrong yet.
Yeah. I have
not been wrong yet.
Okay.
That rhetorical tactic you use may not get you as far as you think it's going to.
Oh, I'm good.
That's all I'm going to say.
Okay.
I mean, assuming you know what's in people's heads before you ask them is always going to be.
Those categories are fine, man. It's actually pretty clear that people who are woke tend to have certain views, and people who are anti-woke tend to be opposed to those certain views. So it's not a completely useless category. I'm just upset. I would say upset, but I'm always concerned at this both sides thing. Clearly, one group meant to cause problems for another. We don't like woke. We don't like woke, so we're going to make it a bad thing. Of course, it started as a positive thing. Yeah. And instead of starting with that and then saying, okay, fine, they did this problem and we deal with it. No, you want to just say, well, we're all equal here. Let's just go in and talk about it equal. That's
also not what he says.
Yeah, not what's going on here.
He didn't say it. I wanted him to say that people
so you want me to make a worse argument so that you can shit on it. No,
I want you to make an accurate argument, not a worse one.
Because no one has a monopoly on redefining terms and poisoning terms for their own.
There you go again with that. But look.
Yeah, the fact that no one has a monopoly doesn't mean that there aren't people who are closer to a monopoly.
Okay, I just look. This is why I'm saying these things are a waste of time, because this is what we end up arguing about instead of arguing about the actual idea at hand, which is the thing that matters. I don't give a fuck what team you think I'm on. I don't care.
Demonetized.
Okay?
I know. That was thing number 10.
I'm sorry.
You're fine, Angel.
I'm sorry.
I can edit that out.
But yeah, I don't care what team you think I'm on. I'm just trying my best to make sense. And you can call me a fence sitter and a centrist and a both sideser or whatever. I don't care, because all I'm trying to do is make sense here. And I think those things, those labels are being thrown at me with a purpose. The purpose is to make me more unlikely to be heard, to make me less understandable, because you go, oh, look at this guy pretending that everything is equal and that both sides are equally guilty. And I didn't say that. But what I did say,
but you did not say it either.
Well, there's a lot that I didn't say. I'm
just letting you know, because that is important.
Okay, hold on a second.
Let me conversation.
Hold on. Let me real quick. Let me make sure I renounce Hitler. Let me.
I gotta go in a second.
I'm not a white supremacist. Let me make sure I say all the things that I didn't say, because then Rod might take me to task for not having said it. That's ridiculous.
In this context, it would have been nice if you would have pointed out the fact that woke was manipulated by right-wing people to push back against social justice.
Yes, and
it seems important to the conversation.
Sure, but all other terms have also been manipulated, and that's part of the issue.
You know.
Oh man, now you're gonna end on that. I didn't even get the chance to.
People on the left use
Sam,
that term
what,
too.
Sam?
Y'all know that, right?
Come on,
I'll
Sam.
just talk about everyone says that the left is redefining all these terms that they're not actually redefining. That are just what happens is there's more cases like, oh look, this professor said this, and it's another whole thing with the disparity of the amount of incidents to the amount of coverage. And I would love to talk about that sometime, Angel. Maybe we can start a podcast about it.
Sure,
Oh,
man.
that would be awesome. I listen to that. Okay,
Sorry-
so
sorry
we're
about that,
4
I'm
minutes from
amped,
the
y'all.
cap. I know. I see, Eric. You're like up, just leaning back. Just
Yeah, I love this.
He's like, I'm ready. Like I stay ready. Okay, so we're gonna wrap up with this because I have so many more questions, but we don't have time for it because I know you guys have to go. But can a couple of people answer Carissa's question? She asked this in regards to the whole discussion. What do you personally hope for our divided discourse on race? What do you hope that happens? Just a couple of people.
I hope more people talk about the history of racism in the United States and the extent of the history and how much of it has been deliberately excluded from public school education throughout our history and continues to be. I hope that people, because I think racism, the number one thing that will change someone who is, I don't like to, someone who has certain racist beliefs or assumptions, the way that those people do change and the way that like white people who are maybe not racist, but ignorant about racism, how they become more educated, and non-white people too, is through close interracial relationships, friendships, and family member relationships. I think that's the like number one way that people come to change their views about racism. And then the second is just being exposed to the sheer extent of the history of racism in the United States, which is in many cases, in I think virtually all cases, underemphasized in a lot of K through 12 U.S. history education, and that all these people promoting like white fragility as a solution, that like, oh, just more teachers need to like investigate their own whiteness. It's like, well, yeah, everyone should investigate themselves, but the solution is not to have individual teachers change their practices. The solution is to look at a systemic and institutional and policy level. What are we teaching, and what are we deliberately not teaching? And like, so this great book by David Blight, Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, talks just about how much the lost cause ideology of the Confederates after the Civil War seeped into American American history education and American just the consciousness. The idea that like Reconstruction was the result of, the brief Reconstruction where we had the first civil rights legislation passed in this country that was then utterly just completely trampled over through Jim Crow and other roundabout things. Like, there's just so much that we don't teach. And I know we can't teach everything, but we could teach a lot more.
Okay.
I agree 100% with what Sam just said. He stole my script.
Nice.
No, I agree with both of them. But my one added piece about this is that we need to be honest. This country is not honest. I said that earlier. And the American exceptionalism is the lie that allow people to not to address race with themselves, as well as what we need to do in this country moving forward, for sure.
He came back for the
Will
end.
is back.
Will, to play
You are
us out.
back. The end. Hey, Will, do you actually want to answer this question since you're here? We're going to end, but this will be good for you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Sorry, guys. This is a mess. Appreciate it.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Thanks for coming back. So
Thanks for teaching the youth of America.
yeah, like doing your due. So what do you personally hope happens with our divided discourse on race? If there's like one or two things, what do you hope, especially as a teacher?
I think although I missed more of this than I would have liked, I think these kinds of conversations, these kinds of conversations where we can dive into the nuance, I think that's a really important part. I have my leanings, but they're loosely held. I can kind of be convinced of a lot of different things, but I think a big thing is just having more of these nuanced conversations, long form. I mean, I was like, oh, I wonder if they'll still be on, and you are. It's like, of course, I like Mark Lamont Hill's show, but it's like I want, like when he had on Chris Rufo or James Lindsay or someone like that. Like I want it stretched out more. I think we have to be willing to have this. I believe that there's a market for it. As far as education goes, I think that we need to all get on board. I hope, and I'm sorry I missed it. I said what I said and I had to get off, but like there are bad ideas being pushed in classrooms under the guise of like critical race theory or critical theory or, aiming for racial justice. And it's not good stuff. And I think that if we can get on board with like, that's bad stuff, then for like my peeps in education, I think that's a big one is like, we can be on board with like, don't do that. And I think coming from, especially like people who are in support of CRT, so, from like Rod, Sam, Shireen and others, I think that would be a really good place to move kind of towards us. And then like, if we're like dividing us, and then we go like, yeah, and we need to recognize that there's important stuff that also needs to be represented. And just being willing to find some common ground and common understanding, I think is really important.
Awesome. So thank you all for tuning in to another successful discussion on American Shade. I think this was awesome and great because it was real, even though there's tense moments, people challenge each other's ideas, but this is what's reality. So I want to thank all of you for coming. Sam, Rod, Shireen, Will, Angel, and Eric. I appreciate you all and your time. And audience, if you are curious to find more out about them, all their information will be linked. So until next time, peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany.
Bye.
Thanks,
Nice hanging with y'all.
Nice hanging with you.
For real.
Peace.